Okay. Okay. So I think let's begin. So hello and a very warm welcome to all of you to this discussion today on when is data a source of comparative advantage in the digital economy. And I want to especially thank our panelists, Gaurav, Julian, and Rahul, for taking time out today to be with us. My name is Nishant Chadha, and I'm the head of research at the Center for the Digital Future at the India Development Foundation. This discussion today is the first in a series that we are organizing as a part of our initiative on choice, competition, and innovation, the ICCI, which is focused on the digital economy. Our objective through the ICCI is to conduct and disseminate research that can inform policy and market regulation of the digital economy. The project is currently financially supported by Facebook, but we are actively seeking partners, individuals, as well as institutions who, want to join us in the effort. So if you're here and you're listening to this and you want to be a part of this, please do reach out to me. Now, coming to the topic for the discussion today, data is like the lifeblood of the digital economy, right? I mean, any service that we use, personalized search or recommendation systems or virtual assistants or Fitbits, anything that essentially depends on providing services that use data-enabled learning. And therefore, obviously, it gives rise to feedback loops, right? So companies provide a service, collect data as a part of that service, and that data enables them to, and learning on that data enables them to provide better services or more services. And this is something, I mean, learning by doing is not new to economists, at least as far as the 1960s and Arrow's paper, we know that learning by doing has efficiency implications. It also has implications for scale of firms, because to achieve efficiency at the firm level, firms need to operate at a certain scale, and that obviously therefore gives them market power as well. And there are a lot of and this is doubly actually for data. This is doubly relevant because data is also non-rival, which means that making it broadly available also may improve overall economic efficiency. So there's a lot of regulatory interventions either being designed or deployed at the moment in the digital economy. They can be ex ante in terms of thinking about or data sharing requirements. They are ex post antitrust actions. Then the privacy regulations, which of course have implications for the type, kind, and amount of data that can be collected and used. So while all of this is going on, I think it is important we believe it is important for regulators to understand, what firm strategies will be, or what strategies firm will or can use, because in the end, regulation is about identifying and remedying strategies that can be detrimental to the overall economy. So this discussion is a small beginning for us at ICCI to do this effort for the data portion of the digital economy, especially in the Indian regulatory context. So again, I'm very happy to have all three panelists here today. And we will begin with Dr. Julian Wright, who is the Lim Chong Yah Professor of Economics at the National University of Singapore. Julian, thank you very much again for being here. And the stage is all yours now.
Thanks, Nisha, and thanks for the invitation. Let me share my screen. Okay, so I think that's a very good introduction to what I'm going to be talking about, which is exactly data-enabled learning and some of the sort of policy implications around that. But before I jump into that, I think it's worth pointing out that in economics, if you look at the study of big data and AI in the recent years, which is a lot of interest, actually most of the work, most of the research is being done around two other aspects of data, which I'm not going to talk about. One being use of data for price discrimination, and the other being use of data for targeted advertising. And obviously that's tied up with privacy aspects as well. And I would say most of the literature is actually focused on those two things. Yet, you know, as Nisha mentioned, like a lot of the stuff that's actually happening is not really about price discrimination, and it's not necessarily about targeted advertising. There's a lot of other stuff happening with data that I think is goes really to the AI part that is actually going to be more prevalent, more important going forward. And you know, here I've got a long list of examples, and there are thousands and thousands of startup examples I can give. Maybe not all of them are familiar. You know, some of them are more for a US audience, but I mean, we're all familiar with search, online search, and the fact that it's using our data when we're searching to improve the search results, depending on what we click on, improve the algorithm and give us better search results over the time. Similarly, like Google Maps or any GPS-based map service, you know, it's using the fact that it has all these users who are traveling around to work out what is the traffic conditions and therefore what is the optimal route. And so again, it's getting better, has this nice feedback loop that it's getting better the more people use it. The more data it ingests, the better the product, attracts more people and so on. Any kind of recommendation service or product built on a recommender service is going to have that similar feature, right? More users, more data, better recommendations, and then attracts more people to use it. And so on and so forth. Autonomous vehicles, right? More cars using the AI to drive autonomously, the better they're able to deal with different situations that may be unexpected, and therefore the sort of predictions get better and it works better. And this also applies to a lot of new smart devices. You mentioned the Fitbit watch and you know, a whole bunch of other smart devices that are getting better the more data they ingest. And my favorite one is the 8 Sleep Smart Bed, which adjusts the temperature throughout the night based on how you react to those temperature adjustments, and learns over time to give you a better sleep. Okay, so this kind of data-enabled learning is affecting every sector of the economy, pretty much any sector that involves, so it has a digital aspect. It's being used in healthcare, in farming, in security, in law. It's across the board. So it's a really important development for the economy, and also for thinking about competition policy going forward. You might ask, like, why is this different from previous learning by doing, as was mentioned, that's always been there. There's a couple of sort of differences. One is more just a matter of sort of scale, which is nowadays it's become much more powerful, this kind of learning, both because of the digitalization of products and that they're in the cloud, so you can ingest a whole lot more data. The storage of that data has become cheaper. The processing of the data has become much more powerful through AI machine learning algorithms. So all of this stuff has really raised the scale at which you can use data in a helpful way. And that has some implications. Firstly, learning from this customer data is becoming a key factor in determining the quality of your product and in competition, right? Like that gives you a big competitive edge if you have better quality data. Another implication is that the learning happens much faster than it used to. Used to be, the learning was some slow process while you did some customer surveys or you collected some data internal to your organization, and then based on that you improved. Now it's happening sort of automatically in many cases, right? So the products are improving in real time as consumers are still consuming them. Just like, the smart bed example or something like Grammarly, it's always getting better as more and more people use it. And thirdly, another implication that's different here is that, because these are digital products and the data is coming from different people, to the extent you collect, you can tie this to different people's usage, you can personalize the products, right? So you can improve the service differently for different people, and that's of course what recommendation services do. Your recommendation is going to be different from mine, and that's better for both of us, hopefully, and that's another implication of this kind of data-enabled learning. Okay, so we can ask the question, when does this data-enabled learning lead to network effects, and how's it different from regular network effects? So just to remind you, regular network effects is the idea that more customers means that there's more value for every customer, right? So Facebook, as an example, a social network, more users on the network, that means more connections, more value for everyone. Or a marketplace, more suppliers means there's more choice for buyers, so there's more value for buyers. More customers means there's more potential sale opportunities for sellers, so more value for the sellers. So we have a regular network effect. And regular network effects, I would argue, are the most important factor if you want to understand why there are competition issues, why there are regulatory issues in digital markets, right? They're sort of at the heart of it. And now you can get a similar thing with data, of course, right? So more customers creates more value for every customer. How does that work? Well, more customers gives you more data. More data allows you to improve the product, and that means more value for customers. That attracts more customers, and so on. So it's a similar positive feedback loop as a regular network effect, but there are some interesting differences as well. Okay. So I want to touch on some differences. Just to point out from the start, like regular network effects, obviously this positive feedback loop can provide a barrier to entry, right? If you've built up a lot of data, you have a better product, and a new company comes in which doesn't have any data, it's very hard for them to compete, right? And second thing to point out is often data network effects get conflated with regular network effects, because many of the companies that have regular network effects, like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, they also have data network effects. And in fact, the data network effects complement their regular network effects. So if you think about a marketplace like Amazon Marketplace, obviously more suppliers and more consumers, the marketplace is getting better for everyone, potentially, but it's also more transactions, more data, then you can better match the buyers to the sellers, you make better recommendations, and that allows you to increase the value of the network effect, the network benefits. So these data network effects are complementing, or data is complementing the regular network effects. Now, whether data necessarily leads to network effects, I mean, the answer is no. It doesn't. And there's sort of a key distinction that we should make at the start, which is there's actually two types of this data-enabled learning. One is that what I call cross-user learning, which is as you get more users so as you get more users, there's more data of these different users, and that allows you to improve the product. Okay, so It's purely the number of users that matters, not how much a particular user is using the product. Or at least what you really care about in these cases is sort of the total amount of data that you've accumulated. You don't care about who the particular user is. So autonomous vehicles, if you're training the AI model for autonomous vehicles, you probably just care about total miles that have been driven, right? Rather than whether the driver was a particular person or not, right? Within user learning, we're talking about the fact that as a particular user uses the product more, we learn about that particular user's, making predictions for that particular user, improving the product for that particular user. So the smart bed was mostly about within user learning. I'm learning how this particular customer sleeps through the night, how that depends on the temperature, and I improve the adjustments, the temperature adjustments for that particular person. So it's getting better for them, but when a new user comes along, well, I don't know anything about this new user, so I haven't improved the product for the new user. So this is a key distinction. There are some products that are mostly across user learning. I mentioned autonomous vehicles. Something like Grammarly, it's pretty much across user learning. Google Maps is across user learning, right? It's not dependent on a particular user. We're not making predictions that are different just because of who you are. Other products, particularly smart devices, tend to be mostly within user learning, right? And obviously there are many examples which have both. So if you're thinking about a recommender system will have both types of learning, because you need to combine the information of different users and also a particular user's repeated usage of the product to make the best recommendations, right? Now, the reason why this distinction is important is because only across user learning can create data network effects, right? Because you think about what a network effect is the product gets better as you have more other users. Well, that requires across user learning. If it's only just getting better for a particular user as they use it more, but that doesn't help learn anything about other users, you're not going to get a network effect. And therefore, if you only have within user learning, you're not going to have data network effects. And with just within user learning, you're not really going to have any advantage in competing for new users. You'll lock in your existing users, but you won't have an advantage competing for new users. On the other hand, if you just have within user learning, what you have is a kind of a switching cost. As users use the product more and more, it becomes better for them, and it becomes hard for them to switch to an alternative product because this product's become very customized to them. And so it creates this kind of endogenous switching cost that gets higher and higher as the consumer uses the product more and more. So it makes the customers very sticky, but it doesn't create a network effect, and it doesn't make it harder for a competitor to come in and attract new customers. So it's important to make these kinds of distinctions. I think an overall theme in some of the work I've done is not all data is the same, and understanding those differences is important. On that theme, one more point, sort of in thinking about these data network effects, is, are they as strong as regular network effects? And in this respect, it really depends on, one important feature would be thinking about the shape of the learning curve, right? In many examples, but certainly not all, but in some examples, the data network effects will tend to run out of steam fairly quickly. So, you don't need millions of drivers to be driving around a city to have good traffic predictions about which route to take. It'll take you, some thousands of drivers, but there's a limit there. And beyond that, there's not much of an additional advantage. So, in that case, you'd say, well, the data network effect may not provide that much defensibility from the point of view of the learning curve. There's other reasons why Google Maps is sticky, but it's not from this. On the other hand, if you think about Google search, the learning curve may be quite long-lasting, maybe keep increasing for a long time because of the importance of understanding all the different edge cases, and that requires a lot of data to fully learn all the different edge cases and make good predictions. And to the extent people choose a search engine that is going to be reliable even for unusual queries, they're going to prefer Google search over alternatives. Okay, so thinking about the shape of the learning curve is one. Some other differences is that with data, often, again, I should say sometimes, they're a good substitute to the ideal data. So, you might be able to purchase or get public domain data that allows you to get the product going, which is not the case for a regular network effect. You can't just sort of access a whole group of customers. You'd have to bribe the customers to join you, and then you probably get the wrong set of customers anyway. So it becomes much harder to sort of catch up with regular network effects than it might with data network effects, to the extent there's alternative data that gets you part of the way there. And then a final point I noted here, which is data network effect businesses may be easier to regulate. So what do I mean by that? If you think about the problem with regular network effect businesses, how are you going to sort of open that up to competitors, those types of businesses? So this was a classic problem in telecommunications, where you sort of said, well, how do I make these telecom networks open to competitors? And the way you do that is you regulate interoperability. So in the telecom case, it was interconnection regulation. You require that they have to be interoperable with other telecom networks, and there's some rules around the pricing of that and so on. That's a very difficult problem, especially if you think about interoperability with some of the modern digital platforms, right? On the other hand, with data, what do you have to do to sort of address the network effect problem? Well, you could just make them have to share the data. So it seems to me that's a easier, sort of from a regulatory point of view, it makes the sort of the bar to regulations somehow seem a lot easier, because I can just say, well, you have to share your data. Now, that may be a bit too simple, because sharing data there's a lot of sort of details in that, and the data could be degraded, and you do that through APIs, and you have to pay, what price do you set on those APIs. But in principle, it does seem a bit easier than just trying to make different platforms, like for instance, different social networks or different marketplaces interoperable. That seems like a very challenging problem if you're trying to address the regular network effects. Okay, so that's sort of background. I have a paper called Data-Enabled Learning, Network Effects, and Competitive Advantage on these topics. I'm not going to go through that paper. Obviously, take a lot longer than time we have available. I just want to point out a few policy implications of that paper, in particular 3. So just to say, well, this is a paper that does look at, it builds a model. It's a fully dynamic model, which has across user learning. It has within user learning, we can completely characterize the equilibrium outcome. One feature of this model is that it has winner-takes-all feature. It's sort of built into the model that there's going to be one winner. That contrasts with many models in industrial organization that try to deal with these topics where the firms are symmetric. Now, neither is perfectly realistic, but I would argue the winner-takes-all feature is probably more realistic for these types of markets than having symmetric firms. And one aspect of this, although the winner takes all, there's going to be one winner, they're going to get all the data, their product's going to be better. So this is sort of reflects the fact that the firms in these models that are competing are in some sense homogeneous other than for the data. It is still the case that the losing firm can constrain the winning firm's sort of ability to price, right? If the price is too high, the losing firm is there to sort of take the customer away. So that's the type of model. Now, to motivate the policy concerns in this setting, so one feature of this model is that as the winner moves further and further ahead, so as it keeps selling, keeps collecting data, the firm that is losing, that's not selling to customers, is sort of falling behind. And as it falls behind, it provides less of a constraint on this leading firm. And what that means is that in this setting, consumers can actually be worse off as a result of the firm learning, right, from their data. So it suggests, well, there could be policy interventions that could benefit consumers. In particular, if you could somehow get the consumers to all coordinate on the firm that's behind and allow it to catch up, it could exercise more of a constraint, and actually the consumers would all be better off. But individually, they don't want to do that because the leading firm is, offering a better product. So it will always win in competition with the firm that's behind. Okay, so with this setting, we look at three, I should say this paper is joint with Andre Hedieu, Boston University. We look at three policies. One is data sharing policy. So based on this logic that I just went through, consumers would be better off if we all coordinate in the firm that's behind. Well, that suggests that if we share the leading firm's data with the firm that's behind, that's going to have that benefit that firms can catch up and exercise more constraint and therefore improve consumer surplus. And that's indeed true. After the data is shared, you'll get stronger competition. That will be good for consumers. But there is a cost of this, or there's a downside potentially, which is the one that we would all naturally think of. If you're going to share the data of the incumbent, then what's the incentive to invest in collecting the data in the first place? Now, in this model, and I think it's natural in this framework of data-enabled learning, what does investment mean? It means basically getting customers, right? That's where the data comes from. It's not like I go out and I have some technology that gathers data. This is data that's coming from the customers themselves. So less investment in collecting data means not being as competitive, not pricing as low, because I don't value capturing the customer data as much. So that's what that's an implication of the model, that if you have a data sharing policy, the downside is that firms have less incentive to accumulate the data, which means they may be less competitive in the first place, right? When they're competing to collect the customers' data by offering them low prices or subsidies. And in particular, the rival the one that's losing may stop subsidizing consumers in order to try and attract them to buy so that they can collect their data. And that weakens the constraint that the rival firms put on the leading firm. So there's a trade-off. And in our model, we actually just determine when the data sharing policy is good for consumers and when it's bad. And we show that it's good when the rival is far enough behind, because it's constraint on the leading firm is very limited anyway. So there's not much of a downside. It's bad when the rival is a sufficiently close competitor, because then the main effect is to weaken this constraint that they put on the leading firm because they have less incentive to compete. So that's one policy that can be looked at in our framework. The second one we look at is privacy. And here we're not looking at like the direct effects of privacy, but rather the indirect effects on competition, which not many people talk about. So if you think about what privacy policy does, a stricter privacy policy, in some way, at a sort of general level, it makes it harder for firms to collect data, or makes it more expensive for them to collect the customer data. And so it's going to slow down their learning from customers. And we can ask the question, well, what effect would that have in our framework? And the main effect is that, or the sort of main result here is that it impacts the firms with less data more than the firm that's ahead. And the simple logic for this, we can understand if the incumbent is already sort of at the top of its learning curve, it's already learned everything it has to learn, then it's not going to be impacted at all by a privacy policy because it doesn't need the customer data anymore. It's fully learned and it's providing the autonomous vehicle that is perfected already. If the firm behind has a lot of sort of still scope to continue learning from data, it's going to be more affected. So in general, whenever the entrant has more scope to learn from data, which is sort of the nature of the problem here, that's why they're the entrant, that's why they're the firm that's behind, they're going to be more affected by a privacy policy than the firm that's ahead. That's also true if the firm that's behind is on the steeper part of their learning curve, which is also a similar feature here that you would expect for a firm that's behind. They've got a lot more to learn, they're sort of learning faster, and any privacy policy that slows down that learning is going to have a bigger impact on them. So it's a rather, we're not saying privacy policy is good or bad here, because we're not looking at the sort of direct costs of privacy or direct benefits of using that data. We're just saying there's a implication for competition, which is not usually considered. So the sort of unintended downside of imposing stricter privacy policies, especially on the entrants and smaller rivals. Okay, the third policy question that we look at is in data acquisitions, and I call this killer data acquisitions. So imagine an outside firm that's been acquired for its data. So here you have, in the same model of incumbent and entrant competing with each other, trying to accumulate data and improve their product. Now there's this outside firm that they can acquire that has a whole lot of data that they can use to improve their product. And they're going to bid for it. Who's going to win that? Who's going to win the bidding to buy that outside firm? So in this case, the incumbent, what we find is the incumbent will generally be willing to pay more to acquire the data than the rival, even though it has much less use for that data. So imagine the incumbent is already at the threshold. It's already learned everything it has to learn from data. And so it has nothing more, no need for the data of this outside firm. And imagine an entrant that is way behind, but with this data could catch up and start competing head-to-head with the incumbent. Who's willing to pay more? Well, if the incumbent wins, he keeps the entrant from competing, right? And so maintains its sort of monopoly position. If the entrant wins, now they're in head-to-head competition. And so the entrant doesn't actually gain that as much because it's going to be competing fiercely with the incumbent. So in this kind of environment, it's actually the incumbent that would buy, you would expect to win the bid and buy the firm, even though it may have no use for the data. So that's why I call it a killer data acquisition, similar to the idea of a killer acquisitions more generally. Okay, so those are three policies that we can look at in the context of our model. I'll stop here and look forward to discussion later.
Thank you, Julian. That was perfect, and you timed it very well. Thank you for that too. And now we have, as our next panelist, we have Dr. Gaurav Jakku, who's an assistant professor of economics at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. And Gaurav, so please go ahead.
So I'll just share my slides. Okay. So hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me. So what I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to look into certain economic properties of consumer generated data and try to link that to the question that has been raised, that whether data is a source of market power or not. So as Professor Rais just said in the beginning of his slides, that the central issue that concerns when we think about data as source of market power is the generation of these feedback loops as a result of these data-induced learning. As more users join a firm or a platform, more data can be generated, which can be fueled back and which can lead to improvement in products or services, and again, which can attract more users. So there is this feedback loops or data-induced learning, or which leads to self-reinforcing cycles. Now the question is, when these feedback loops can be very strong, and the stronger the feedback loops, the higher the possibility that concentration of data will lead to concentration of market power in the hand of big firms. So let's take a step back, and Professor Wright has also discussed few of the properties when he was discussing his paper. So I'm just going to discuss three main issues surrounding certain economic properties of user data and link that with the question of when the data can be a source of market power. So I'll talk briefly about scarcity of data, the question of scarcity of data, then whether we have economies of scale, and then not just scale, but also the economies of scope in data collection, and think about what market condition, market features, under which these can be important and can result in data advantage. So first, the issue of scarcity of data. Now, when we are saying that data is going to lead to market power, I mean, one of the question can come is data is going to be handed a few firms, or data can be available to a lot of firms. That issue has to be understood first. The basic premise for that to understand is first underlying one of the properties of data, which Nishant was also mentioning in his opening remarks, that it is non-rival in nature. Basically, the value of data won't diminish as more firms would use it. So a certain entity is collecting a piece of information does not preclude any other firm from using that information. Now, I think it's theoretically right that to say that data is non-rival, but that of course does not imply that data is going to be accessible to a lot of firms. And one obvious explanation for that could be, of course, there are a lot of fixed costs that we should not ignore. High level of fixed costs, because there's a lot of investment going into the creation of these data infrastructure, data centers, which collect, process, and eventually make some inferences from the data that is collected. So the next is, if data is not, the firm cannot collect data because of this high fixed cost. Can it buy data, or can it collect data from third parties? Yeah, again, that to an extent, yes, it can be a substitute, but I still think that the kind of data that these third parties can provide, that cannot be a strong substitute that you can directly collect from your own firm or platform. So think of behavioral data and the data that you can collect from your own platform. So firms can have, there are cookies that collect data about users, their behavior when they are visiting third-party websites, but that only tells us what they are doing over those websites. I mean, it cannot replace the data that we have and that we can collect from a platform, for instance, like social demographic information about a user. I mean, that cannot be replaced by that. And of course, that is as important as getting access to third-party data. The next underlying issue when we think of scarcity of data is data widely available? That is one. That was one of the, in fact, claims made in one of the merger decisions, that they did let go that merger because data is going to be available to other competitive firms. The underlying premise is because these firms have access to data, and even though these data points are different, we can still draw similar inferences from those data points. For instance, you can understand music preferences of a user, and this can be done using search query data. That is one way. When user is searching for putting in some music query, or of course through social media activity, their posts, their likes, etc. That can also help us decipher what are the music preferences of a user. But again, to an extent, yes, these inferences can be drawn, but again, we cannot come to the conclusion that there is a strong substitute between different data points. For instance, just to come back to this search data versus social network data, I think it's search data that tells us what is the current decision making that is going in the mind of a user, which we cannot determine from social network data. Or if we think of data from PC, laptops, computer, vis-a-vis data from mobile, again, it's the latter that can give us and tells us the underlying location of the user, but we cannot be, of course, thinking about that from PC or computer. Coming to economies of scale in data collection, again, that's very important to understand that, and Professor Julian paper is linked to this, that when can these scales be important? So just to give an example of what economy of scale can look like. So to example of search platforms, the more observation you have on a search query, the better the predictive power of that search engine can become. Now, coming back to the question of when these scales can be important. So first, let us see if the situation when these scale might not be important. So as in Professor Wright paper, he said that, there can be decreasing marginal returns to scale, that the additions to the value of data decreases once you have a sufficient minimum threshold of getting a data set, or the value of data may decrease over time. To take an example, think of advertising markets. Historical data can tell us about the trends of placing products in online advertising, but it is current data that tells us what should be the placement of an ad in real-time bidding. And yes, it's just not data that is important, but also the quality of algorithms. And I think here Professor Wright paper stated that even though if an entrant has a data disadvantage in the beginning, but if it has a good algorithm, good data learning technology, it can still overcome that disadvantage and win in the future. I think that was the point he made in his paper, one of the central results. Now coming to when the scale of data can be important and can lead to a source of market power. So first, not all data is transient. I mean, we do, for instance, the data that the social network collects on social demographic information, on gender, date of birth, etc. They tend to create super user profiles with that data. And the value of that does not decrease over time. So we cannot say that all data is transient. So there's a lot of data sets that are available in the market, and their value remains there. The second point is just not data collection. We should also understand what are we actually doing with the data. So not just the predictive power that the firm is interested in, but eventually how that firm monetizes that. The value of inference. And when we think about the value of inferences, it's not just the quality of inference, but also the quantity of observation that a firm has. To take an example, suppose using a small data set, the firm can come to a conclusion that, let's say a man with brown hair may like a certain hair product. That is a firm can infer, and for that, only we require a small data set. But the next question is, how do we value that? How a firm can monetize that? For that, of course, even though we needed a small data set to ascertain that inference, we would still require a large data set to create value out of that inference. Because it's only through large data set we will be able to determine how many customers are there with brown hair, for instance. So it's not just quality of inference, but also the value that you get from that inference. That is equally important to think about. And yes, these big firms, the number of inferences that they have to make on a daily basis is huge. Professor Wright was talking about edge cases. I mean, similar to that, to take an example of search engine, because the search queries they face are huge and diverse. To answer those rare search queries, compare the ability of a small search engine with a small number of users on it vis-a-vis the search engine with a large number of users on it. Which search engine will have a better predictive ability? Of course, the search engine which has a larger data set will be able to answer these rare search queries. So under these conditions, these are some of the issues that I'm highlighting. Then, even though on face it might look that scale is not important, there might be diminishing returns. But if we think a bit deeper, we will see, yes, the scale of data collection becomes an important issue. And not just the scale, but also the economist scope in data collection that I want to talk about. So what is economist scope in data collection? To state it, it's basically increased power of a firm to predict due to an increase in the variety of data. Not just the increase in observation, but for a particular observation, the variety of data that firm can get. In fact, this is underlying premise of Professor Wright said that it's killer acquisition. The number of acquisition that these firms have been over time doing. For instance, I got this data from a recent research paper. It was published in Information Economics and Policy. That over the last 5 years, these big tech firms have been, going and acquiring a lot of small firms in unrelated markets, and that has something to do with the underlying economy of scope in data collection. And what is that leading to? It's leading to interconnected, intertwined market structure, where a dominant firm, it is there in the origin market, and then it enters the target market and collect information and finance and use that to monetize in the origin market. To take an example, think of target market as smartphone operating system. Yeah, just 2 minutes. Smartphone operating system, and the original market is search engine. So Google entered into smartphone operating system, and now it can use the location data from smartphone and mix that with the search queries to answer those search queries better. How it affects welfare? Well, it depends on from the benefit side. It can lead to personalization, of course. It can lead to more targeted advertising. But there's a flip side to that. There are costs attached to that. There are concerns for privacy. There's a concern of monopolization of the ecosystem as a result of this intertwined market structure. So eventually, the welfare effect will depend, on the weights of these two. So to conclude, yeah, that's where I will stop. So when we're talking about data as source of market power, we just not look into. We should not draw straight away conclusion. Some of the issues that I highlighted is that we need to look into scarcity of data, but also the scale and scope of data collection. And I'll stop here and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Gaurav. Thank you so much. And our last panelist for the day, last but not the least, is Rahul. Rahul Rai is an independent competition lawyer. And, by the way, everybody on the panel except Rahul is an economist. So Rahul, the responsibility of injecting color into this discussion is now all yours.
No, thank you, Nishant, for inviting me. And thank you, Professor Julian and Professor Gaurav, for a very helpful presentation. I think I would start by saying that your paper and your presentation should also be made to all the staff and members at the Competition Commission of India. It would be very, very helpful for all of us in the competition bar and the practitioners of this law in this country. There is a lot to learn here. We have about 12 years of enforcement experience in this country, which is nothing in comparison to what the experience has been in more mature competition law jurisdictions. And yet we have come a long distance in the last 12 years. We sat down as lawyers and students to examine the Commission's decisions in every single abuse of dominance case and every single vertical restraint case to understand the very first question as to how the Commission tries to identify or ascertain whether an enterprise is in a dominant position. And this question of data sharing and data leading to incumbents getting more entrenched, or the leading firms creating that deep blue sea between the next placed, best placed rival. All of these questions arise when the Commission is tasked with the with the question of identifying and ascertaining whether an enterprise is in a dominant position or not. If it's a young enterprise, if it's a new entrant which is collecting data at a fast pace, unlikely that the commission will ever need to examine an issue like this. And here, I think that our law is very clear. It has introduced a definition which has got nothing to do with the modes. Of course, it will look at the modes through which firms increase their ability to either charge higher prices or offer lower quality, which the law has expressed in terms of ability to act independent of its competitors or customers. So the definition of who is a dominant enterprise is a very well-crafted definition. The Act says that an enterprise which has the ability to act independent of its customers or competitors is a dominant enterprise. And therefore, data, if a firm has collected data, if a firm has reached that level where it is reaping the benefits of data network effects, is yet another factor like the factor of market shares is. It has to be, though, examined across the various layers that Professor Julian pointed out. So, for example, is the data leading to network effects because of cross-consumer learnings? Is it leading to better products but targeted at a specific customer? And these are the learnings that the Commission and the Indian competition law bar, as well as the economists who are practicing in this area in India, need to be conscious of. That our law is quite clear. Data is yet another factor which could help an enterprise reach a position of dominance. It is, though in certain situations, it can create barriers to entry, which might appear a little difficult to breach. And the trick is to identify those situations, not because someone has amassed vast amounts of data that enterprise should be termed as dominant. We need to look at that in the context of how high the barriers to entry have become due to the kind of data and the volume of data that they have amassed in the context of the specific product or service that they are offering. So, for example, and Julian, this comes from your paper. There are other authors who have written about this in the context of self-driving cars. India is a very, very big country with the conditions of roads dramatically different across neighborhoods beyond 5 kilometers. And therefore, can the data that someone has amassed over a period of 10 years be shared with a new entrant, and will that help? These are the questions that need to be answered. And I'll give one small example here, which one of the leading Indian paints player has adopted, Asian Paints. It has relatively very high market shares in the market for paints. A lot of that has come from the efficiencies that they've achieved in distribution of their products. But they were able to do it because probably they were one of the, what I hear is that they were probably the first private sector enterprise in the country to import supercomputers into India and use that for collecting and analyzing data at the distribution points. And the ability that they have generated through the analysis of data over the last 40 years is that they are able to predict which neighborhood would require what color of paint on which day of the week at what point during the day. And that has given them an immense ability to offer their products more competitively compared to their rivals. The question that here arises is that, yes, data collection and analysis has helped them, but can someone else do it also? And with these 2 points, which is that look at the law, it gives you the framework to assess whether someone is dominant or not, and apply that framework specific to the context that you are examining a question. Don't simply jump to the conclusion that if someone has, for example, 90% market share, he or she is dominant. And likewise, you juxtapose that to data area and say that, look, you've been collecting data or you have amassed data over a customer base of 200 million customers, and therefore you are in a dominant position. We need to look at each product segment. We need to look at each industry or each service that someone is targeting by collecting data. And that's where our ability to get to the right answers will come from. Simply jumping to the conclusion that data can lead to data network effects, when coupled with traditional network effects, it can lead to greater dominance, might be unhelpful, if not entirely incorrect. So I'll stop there and happy to answer specific questions that you may have related to how this law has panned out in the context of abuse of dominance and data and assessment of dominance.
Thanks, Rahul. Thank you very much. So I have there are a few questions, I think, already in the Q&A box. And again, as a request to everybody, just please put the questions in the Q&A box so I can read them. But before I go there, I have one question for Julian, which I think is an important point, but did not come out in the presentation. So I'm going to put the question to him. So Julian, one of the important, to me, one of the critical features in the model that you develop is the ability of the firm, especially the losing firm, to price below cost. Because if you, what you call the subsidy to the consumer, and that is actually the competitive instrument that the losing firm is using to move customers away from the winning firm, and that actually produces, it was a constraint on the advantage that the incumbent firm enjoys. You know, and one of the reason I'm bringing this question up, and I want you to clarify that point, is because such behavior, below cost marginal pricing, is actually, you know, in a traditional sense would be considered anti-competitive in some cases. And also there is a discussion in Indian regulation about deep discounting in some sense, right, by e-commerce firms, and how that can be anti-competitive. So I think I just wanted you to comment on that so that we can bring that point out if you.
Sure. And I mean, that's this idea that you might price below cost is also something that comes up with regular network effects, I should add, right? Like there's nothing specific about data. When you have network effects, you want to invest in building up your customers, right? That's very natural. And how do you invest? Well, you offer them something, you know, sometimes you offer them something for free, which we see a lot of big tech companies doing, right? They get a lot of free stuff, which is great for consumers. But of course, what they're doing with that is they want you to use it so they can get your data. And there's similar things going on here. And so in our model, we just model it as, you know, through price. So you both the incumbent and particularly the entrant, that's an important strategic element for them, the ability to set price below cost so as to attract customers, so as to get their data, so as to improve the product. Obviously, more generally, sometimes it wouldn't be through price, right? It would be through offering, you know, something for free. But it's the same idea. And you know, in network effect businesses and two-sided markets, we see very common that at least on one side of these two-sided markets, you know, consumers, often on the consumer side, they're getting things below cost, and there's nothing predatory about that. It's just part of competition, and indeed it can persist even as, you know, these firms continue to compete in the long run, right? It's not a like normal predation where it's a temporary reduction in order to somehow monopolize the market.
There are actually a couple of questions, but they relate sort of to the same points. I'm going to put this question in the following way. I think the question relates to the fact that if we do bring in regulation, do you believe that regulation should be different for certain firms which enjoy typically something called the gatekeeper status, typically, right, which is the CMA uses, which is this whole idea that firms with significant market power, should be subject to different obligations than other firms. So I think this question, if any of you want to comment on this, whether you believe that regulation should be market specific or it should be economy wide, whether or how to decide that. If you have any comments on that, I'm just putting two questions together. Julian, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, couple of thoughts on this. So one is clearly you wouldn't want to impose some of these, if you were going to impose regulations such as data sharing or more restrictive merger practices and so on. Obviously, it wouldn't be or shouldn't be applied across the board to all firms, as if all firms, somehow were in the same position, which they're not, right? Otherwise, you'd have the situations where small firms had to share data and were under the same kinds of restrictive conditions. Here, you're talking about regulatory approaches. So, yes, it makes sense to try and define those firms and in those markets where there is a problem, where there is a market failure, and address the regulations towards those firms and markets. So I would say even more than that, than what you propose. I think if you look at Europe, some of those proposals are sort of, there's a set of firms, but they apply to those firms no matter what market they're in. And I would actually prefer sort of more like the UK approach, where you find, for particular firms in a particular market, we've found there's a market failure, there's clear dominance or whatever the criteria is, and now we're going to impose these regulations in that case. And the same firms acting in other markets may be fine, right? And there's other markets you may not have an issue, and so you don't need to impose the regulations there.
Gaurav, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was thinking about an example where I can think of so I was thinking of data portability as an example, like as a regulation, and whether that we can straight away apply to every market. So I'm just going to answer in that context when we think of data portability. So, I mean, in that context, the question comes, whose data it is we are transferring from one firm to another, because generally there is a question of complexity, ownership complexity there. For instance, in case of social networks. So suppose we say we can transfer data from social network to another, then of course my data points are mixed with the elements of other data points. So if we are going to remove those some data point which pertain to other users and then transfer that, then of course the effectiveness of that regulation would be lower. Similarly, I can think for the same regulation, I can think of an example. I mean, most likely this regulation can work when services depend on individual level data. So think of targeted advertising. So in that context, data portability might have more effectiveness. Why? Because when you're giving targeted ads, you are using individual level data to place products for the individual to see. Vis-a-vis compare the mapping service. Let's say you can transfer your data of your ride history, etc., from one map service to another. In that case, the data at the individual is less important than the data at the aggregate level, which Professor Rais was also saying, across user learning. That is the term, or we can also call it the social value of data. So thinking of data portability, yeah. So markets where social value is less important might be more effective. Yeah.
Rahul, do you want to?
Yes, thank you, Nishant. I wanted to make a larger point here, which is that if and when we decide to intervene, it looks more likely it's a question of when in India. We need to balance two things. There is a market leader who, on the strength of its hard work, has reached that leading position. And of course, it's the very nature of competition is to maximize your reach in the market. If we are to intervene and let's say force data portability, or if we are to intervene and let's say cap market shares, then we need to balance that with the idea or whatever tool that we devise, which is data portability or capping market shares or special responsibilities in terms of prohibition on self-preferencing, etc. We need to perhaps consider the least intrusive, the least extent. It has to be the most restricted intervention. If we choose a broad-based intervention, then where we stand today as a country, and if we take examples of each of the industries where data network effects have been argued to have led to one leading player established, we are seeing that newer players are coming into picture. Take, for instance, social media. In social media, where Facebook or Meta is today, is perhaps facing a lot of constraints because there was a firm called TikTok which came up with a user interface which was so easy to use that the newer generation started migrating to TikTok, right? So while there was the possibility that Facebook's position was entrenched for a much longer period of time, someone came up with the idea of simplifying the user interface, making it more interesting. And therefore, that ecosystem where you are guiding people to work hard, to think more creatively, might slow down if they are given the option of using a data regulation or an antitrust regulation to try and secure access to that data. So we need to find the right balance. And my own sense is that we are a growing country, we are a young country. In every product segment, we have got domestic players who are punching way above their weight. And we need to find that point of intervention which is not very extensive. We need to promote entrepreneurship. Let's take that risk. And God forbid there is any one market where market failure is staring in our face. Then there is our antitrust law as it stands today has a provision which says that the commission has the power to even direct breaking up of dominant enterprises. The commission also has the power to come out with remedies which require perhaps which can require people to deal with others. So steer, it's a question of when, not if, as I started saying, because there's just too much pressure on policymakers to come out with some interventionist tool. But if you have to, then make it the least interventionist tool is what I would say.
Thanks. Actually, my next question, I'll start with you because I had this, somebody asked that question on the chat as well, which is this idea that, imposing any sort of data sharing requirement, as Julian also pointed out, sounds easy, but it's actually an extremely complicated task because in actual implementation, there are huge information asymmetries. What I collect and what I have is really almost impossible to figure out without incurring a lot of regulatory cost. So my sort of question is that, as you said, if this happens, or when you think it's a question of when, how would adjudication or courts respond to this? How do you deal with a situation where you have this huge information asymmetry, somebody's trying to do something? How do you recover? How will the commission do its job? And in the past, do you think it has, do you see any method into what they have done and in their ability to actually uncover something like this?
I have a lot of respect for the Indian Commission. They have worked with significant constraints to get to where they are. To give you an example, over the last 12 years, they have worked with roughly about 20 case officers on the investigation for cartels, abuse of dominance, vertical restraints at the CCI, and roughly about 20 investigators at the Director General's office. And they have had to deal with about 1,000 cases, a little short of 1,000 cases, so which works out to about 70 odd cases per year. that's a lot of workload. Compare that, to that, add the point that their annual budget for 2021 was about $6.5 million. The Federal Trade Commission has about $250 million annual budget. Right? So we are working with a lot of constraints. What that means is that that's one. Two, we have been learning on the job. Everyone in India on the competition law side, on the economic side, we have benefited from the experience and expertise of experts from outside India. But on the law side, every single person has learned on the job. On the regulator side, every single person has learned on the job. It's been a steep learning curve, but have they, while constructing or devising remedies, gotten to a point where they can balance all of these considerations in the most appropriate way and devise the most appropriate remedy? And answer there is that we have some distance to go. And I'll give you one example. It concerns automobile industry. I give you this example because for me, it's really an outlier case on the absurdity of the remedy suggested by the CCI. This is a case which concerned alleged abuse by automakers, automobile makers, passenger car makers in the aftermarket for spare parts. And one of the remedies suggested by the commission there is that why don't you work together to create certain common parts across different automobile companies and across different automobile models that ply on Indian roads. It's the whole idea that you compete on merits, that you differentiate your product from another, took a beating here. In some sense, that remedy itself was anti-competitive, or could have, or would lead to an anti-competitive outcome if it was to be implemented. So we have a lot to learn when we need to construct remedies and how to do that. And I think that learning curve can be shortened if we implement a small tweak in our law. Our law today does not allow for the mechanism, what we call a settlement and commitment mechanism. It's a mechanism through which, if a regulator identifies certain problems, it reaches out to the enterprise against who those problems have been identified, and it facilitates a conversation between the two to try and reach a middle ground and address that problem by the enterprise in question suggesting some solutions. In UK, for example, these suggested solutions are put up for public consultations. So the regulator there is conscious that they are limited in their ability. They're conscious that what is being put to us by the enterprise in question may not be the most appropriate solution. So they put it out for public consultations. And it's after the process of discussions followed up by public consultations that they reach the final settlement arrangement. And if we do that, then we are actually, in some sense, crowdsourcing the ability to find the right remedy. It's consultative and it takes the inputs from the wider stakeholders. This could, this small tweak in our law could help us, get over the trouble that we have right now of capacity and expertise constraint.
Thanks, Rahul. So we are almost at the end of the allotted time. Julian, Gaurav, any final comments before we end this particular session?
I mean, just to, I guess, re-emphasize this point that I think it's been made by everyone here, which is there are many different facets to data. It's not just sort of this view that you have a whole lot of data, therefore you must, you must have a dominant position and you must win. There's many aspects to that data. I like to give this example of the startup firm X.AI, which creates a virtual assistant for booking your calendar. Because the founder of that company was asked, how can they possibly compete with Google, given it has Gmail, right? And has all that data from all the Gmail. How can this company, which is trying to build a virtual AI for booking your boss's calendar through email. How can they possibly compete? And the founder basically said, Google has no data compared to us because they have no data which involves humans booking with virtual assistants, and therefore their data is useless. And was completely, very confident. He's raised a lot of money, very confident that they're going to win in this space. And we've seen lots of examples where these small companies in specialized verticals can beat the big companies. Of course, there are other examples where the data that these big tech companies have gives them a huge advantage. So we need to look into the details of the data and just not treat it as if it's all the same.
Thanks, Julian. Gaurav?
Yeah, so of course, data is a very complex issue, and I think it's an ongoing research. Even I am doing some research. Professor Rais is also bringing new papers that are trying to understand different, aspects of data collection, market power, and welfare. So I think eventually, whichever way the regulation is, the question boils down to understanding what are the expected consumer gains eventually from pursuing that regulation vis-a-vis the expected gains from keeping the status quo, and understanding what are the gains of not bringing that regulation. So I think understanding that question in future is going to be very important, and trying to find out when we can exactly find some answer to that. I think that's very important.
Thank you. Thanks, Gaurav. And so thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you especially to Gaurav, Julian, and Rahul. I think it was a fantastic discussion. We are, of course, as I said, this is, and Gaurav very rightly said, we are just starting. Hopefully, we won't come up with regulatory interventions that do significant damage while the theory is trying to catch up. But thank you very much. We will be in touch with all of you, and thank you for a fantastic session. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.